Hello, merry almost Halloween. It's Diet Coke party time. I've been reading lots of Gothic non-fiction books, which I thought would be a good thing to share for Halloween, or if you read them and want to pass them on, there's All Hallows Read, where you just give someone a spooky book. The first one is Smoke Gets in Your Eyes by Caitlin Doty. She does a YouTube channel called Ask a Mortician, and I recently discovered her, and she's really informative and really funny, and her videos are addictive. You know, you just want to keep watching more and more of them. And she wrote a book called Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, which is about her life as a mortician, or in the death industry basically, and her formation of the Order of the Good Death, which is a website she runs, and she does talks with lots of other people in the death industry. Because I didn't expect to have my philosophy on death challenged by a book. I thought it was just going to be a bit of fun, reading about her embarrassing moments or experiences with dead bodies and such. But it really got me thinking, because she believes that in the West we've got our attitudes to death all mixed up. We're kind of more terrified of it because we aren't involved in it as much as we used to be. We just want to get rid of the bodies as quickly as possible, and she doesn't really like embalming that much either. She says you can do it if you want, but funeral homes make people think that you have to do it, which isn't true. At first I thought, well, like, how is that really going to change very much? But then she kind of points out that we also hide away our elderly, and in other cultures they have elderly relatives come and stay with them, whereas here we're kind of quite squeamish about old age as well, and it could be related. So it's definitely something to think about, and I thought about this non-stop for about 2 days until I came to the conclusion that I think she's probably right. So it started off as a book that I thought was going to be just entertaining, and became a lot more. So Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, Caitlin Doty, I really recommend it. It will make you think. And all of the books that I mention, I'm going to put more information in the description, so have a look. The next one is Ghostland by Colin Dickey. I actually found this from another booktuber, and so I was excited because it was my first BookTube recommendation, and this is such a good book. It is really interesting, and what makes it different is that it explores the ghost stories of America, but it looks at the reality behind them and looks at the psychology behind what produced these particular stories. For example, the Winchester house, which is a very famous house, sort of run by the wife of the man who invented the gun. And in folktale, she's terrified of death and terrified of retribution from ghosts who want to get back at her for the deaths that her husband caused with the guns. And so she keeps building more and more of this house in order to confuse the spirits. But when you read the book, it looks behind all of that and kind of blows all that away and looks at the reality. And I love that. It's my favourite thing to sort of brush away the stories and look at the truth. It's far more interesting for me, and it doesn't ruin anything for me at all. If anything, it makes you appreciate these things even more. Another really good bit, it discusses how the KKK actually formed, and they wear white robes because they used to dress up as ghosts to frighten ex-slaves into not leaving the area, because obviously once slavery ended, a lot of ex-slaves thought, well, I don't really want to hang around in this little place in the south where I was treated really appallingly. I want to go and seek my fortune somewhere better. But you know, the locals needed their industry, they needed their hard work still, so in order to frighten them off, leaving, they would dress up as ghosts and visit them in the middle of the night. And the thing is the book points out that it's hard to say whether they were actually scared, thinking that they were real ghosts. It's probably unlikely. They probably just thought, oh, well, this is how the world is. I might as well just stay and, you know, put up with it. And like, my friends and family are here, so what can you do? But yeah, I really recommend it. Ghostland is very interesting. Next one was a book that I read so fast. The Caitlin Doughty one I read in about a day. This I also would have read in a day if it hadn't been so long, but I pretty much read it in just a couple of days, really. Romantic Outlaws by Charlotte Gordon, and it's about Mary Shelley and her mother Mary Wollstonecraft. And what it does is it takes a chapter of Mary Shelley, well, a chapter of Mary Wollstonecraft first, and then a chapter of Mary Shelley, going from their childhood to adolescence to adulthood. It's fascinating. I learned so much about, I'm really inspired by Mary Shelley. I first read Frankenstein when I was 14, and it had a really big effect on me. I loved it. I learned a lot about Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a feminist writer, and how, what really was interesting to me is how her reputation has changed simply because of a book that her husband released after her death, in which he kind of wanted her to appear more demure and traditionally ladylike. But apparently it's really affected her reputation, and this book seeks to put that right and show you the real Mary Wollstonecraft. You just really feel their disappointments and their heartbreak, and you're involved in their story, and she writes somehow very immediately, so even though it was so long ago, you feel like you're right there. When I was reading it, my boyfriend Bill would kind of keep saying pardon, because I would go, oh, you bloody... I was like getting annoyed at stuff that was happening in the book. The next one is Witchfinders by Malcolm Gaskill. I mentioned this one in World's Worst Book Tag. It is really informative. If you're researching the UK witch trials and the Witchfinder General, Matthew Hopkins, and his assistant John Stern, it's probably the best book that you can read. And if I write anything set in that era, I will make sure to read it again. It starts off fascinating, but for some reason, I don't know why, it kind of seemed to, my interest burned out like about halfway through. It just started to feel like a lot of events and names and different areas that they travelled to. And there are some poetic moments. He's not a boring writer, but there was some sort of spark that was just lost. So if you're going to read it for pure entertainment, I'm not so sure that this was the one for me. It just seemed to, I started to skim read it, and that's probably not a good sign. Weirdly enough, the UK witch trials took place mostly in Essex County, Suffolk and Yarmouth. And the people of Massachusetts, in the area of Salem, where the American Salem witch trials took place, were mostly from that area. They'd named the area Essex County, and 50 years after the UK trials, they had the Salem witch trials, which I found like a really bizarre coincidence. I don't know if the people of that area were particularly prone to superstition or fear, or, I mean, it was perhaps a hard winter and people who were desperate do desperate and strange things. Another book that I read was The Witches, Salem 1692, A History by Stacey Schiff. And this I really do recommend for entertainment. It's so interesting. She really makes you feel as much as you can the people involved as people. You're kind of looking into what may have driven them, because there's a lot of theories on why Salem may have happened, from ergot poisoning to people wanting other people's land, which, as she says, explains some of what happened but not the whole thing. And she really looks at everything and makes you almost feel as if you were there. Mass hysteria is a thing that particularly gets my brain tickling, and that's probably definitely an example of mass hysteria. Another good example of mass hysteria, if you want to look it up, is the hysterical dancing. Now that was a time. The next one, continuing on the romantic writers era, is Byron by Phyllis Grosskirth. Bits of it are really enjoyable. I was reading it like he was involved with his sister. You know, it's kind of like almost like his life is basically a gossip column. You know, you can't help but for it to be endlessly fascinating. But different areas get kind of short shrift, like the time spent in the Villa Diodati with Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley. And weirdly enough, the author of The Monk showed up as well. What's his name? Matthew something. He showed up briefly, which I didn't know. That gets very short shrift. It looks at mostly the time that he spent travelling around, which is still interesting, but perhaps not as much of a draw as other elements of his life. There were a couple of things that I didn't agree with. I'm not sure when this book actually was written. More than one female is described as silly, often dismissed as just duplicitous. And there's a moment, for example, in Byron's life where, when he was very young at school, he was invited to a teacher's place and left in an upset hurry, and you find out through his letters afterwards that he, like something like the teacher basically interfered with him, and the book makes out like he just felt kind of embarrassed of it. He just didn't want people to know. He regretted it. And I was reading it thinking, I kind of think maybe that is a big deal. Maybe that was a dodgy situation for him that could possibly account for a lot of, at least some of his anger in later life, because his mum insisted on continuing her friendship with this man, and he saw that as a huge betrayal. Perhaps the author's got outdated opinions. I don't want to just dismiss the book like that, because it is an interesting book, but it made me want to read something else about him instead, perhaps. Also, a couple of picture books that I can recommend. There is some writing in them, but they're mainly focused on pictures. Is A Haunted Air by Ossian Brown. It's got a foreword by David Lynch, and it's filled with pictures of vintage Halloween costumes. You might have seen some of these online, but Halloween costumes are very different to what people do now, mostly anyway. They're kind of more makeshift, more homemade. There's a very eerie quality to them because the pictures don't have any kind of background information. It's just like a child in this horrific outfit. And there's also a classic Wisconsin death trip by Michael Lisi. That's it's also a documentary, kind of a documentary, but the book is pictures from the time of the late 1900s in Wisconsin, which was a really difficult time to live, and in the snowy winter months people could get very desperate and do very strange things, like there'd be a lot of murders, or people would just despair and do away with themselves. But it's fascinating, and there are photographs that go with press clippings from the time. Okay, that was my massive Gothic non-fiction book wrap up. Merry spooky time.